So let's get them, come along then, and I'll wear my Russian shirt. So let's raise our fists together, and let's have someone get hurt. Okay, they got the money back, we have got the looks. Okay, they got the money back, we have better books we actually read. I said fuck you, we don't need you, let's bomb the bourgeoisie. We are happy and you copy, let's bomb the bourgeoisie and come with me. They have Parsis and Mercedes, and they draw them out of school, but they fail in every subject, they pretending that it's cool. But they don't have to care about their future life, because their daddy's gonna buy them everything until he dies. I said fuck you, we don't need you, let's bomb the bourgeoisie. We are happy and you copy, let's bomb the bourgeoisie and come with me.
You're listening to Radical Minds on WHPK 88.5 FM, the pride of the South Side. It's currently 3 minutes after 3. Today's show comes in the wake of the Platypus Convention, the 5th International Platypus Convention, held over the weekend at SAIC. I'm sure that we announced that more than once here on Radical Minds. And as a result, we have in the studio today two guests who came, one member of Platypus, Lucy Parker, and James Turley of the Communist Party of Great Britain. And also joining me in the studio is Chris Catrone, who's been on the show more than once, the president of the Platypus Affiliated Society. Today we're going to build off of one of the panels that we had at the convention on the subject of imperialism and why we're against it. That panel was moderated by Lucy Parker, and so I'm going to ask Lucy to just discuss briefly the main questions that the panel asked and to talk about the composition of that panel. Now, so Lucy, tell us about the imperialism panel at the convention.
Yes, well, thanks for inviting me on the show. It was my initiative to host this panel this year at the convention, partly because 2013, we're at 10 years since the beginning of the anti-war movement over Iraq, and I thought it would be a good opportunity for us to host another event on imperialism and why we're against it on the left, by inviting Larry Everest from the RCP, Joseph Green from a small organization called Communist Voice based in Detroit, and then James here, who we have with us from the Communist Party of Great Britain. And we've also been reading Imperialism, the Highest Stage of Capitalism, Lenin's text in the Platypus Reading Group. So it was a good opportunity for me to reflect on the importance of that text and what it might mean for the left today, if anything, in relation to questions of anti-imperialism, both over Iraq and in more recent events in relation to Syria and Libya. So I think the first question we asked was really in relation to how the panelists felt responded to Lenin's positions on imperialism, and I feel like perhaps on the panel that we didn't really get into that discussion very much. James did speak to that point, but we did spend more time on the panel itself on the question of Iraq and the anti-war movement. But
so there's a kind of a double context here. On the one hand, it's over 10 years since the beginning of the anti-war movement, now in sort of total collapse, even as there's been a new range of issues after Iraq with the intervention in Libya, the possible intervention in Syria, of course, the very dramatic French intervention in Mali, but also the way in which this history and its failure recently invokes the past, and I think James did in his opening comments speak to that. So you spoke a great deal about what seems like ancient history. Talk a bit about that ancient history and how you think it sort of bears on the present.
Well, this thanks for inviting me. And yeah, well, it'd be good to get more into these sorts of issues because they didn't really come up that much. It was the kind of the context is precisely the Lenin text, which is of a piece with Second International Marxism more broadly, that interprets the continental European colonial acquisitions as in that sense representing a radically a new stage, as it were, of capitalism. And you have divergent accounts of that, of which Lenin's is the one that has survived on the left most consistently. And I'm coming from a position which has been kind of developed as far as I know at most length by my comrade Mike McNair in the CPGB. It's not a general CPGB position. I think there are still leading members who support Lenin's analysis in that regard. But the idea of it is that instead of treating imperialism and the many of the features in terms of the relationship between states and sort of, I suppose, capitalist classes in particular countries as a new stage, rather it becomes we view it as in that sense an inherent tendency that's there from, in that sense, the initial embryonic capitalist states. And the kind of the classic early examples would be that in the Italian city-states, which were, in the strict sense, bourgeois state regimes, or kind of mercantile capitalist regimes. And they came up too early and dissolved fairly quickly, and that's where Machiavelli, in a sense, comes out of, and things like that. But what's interesting is almost as soon as these state regimes emerge out of the pre-existing kind of feudal regimes, you get the acquisition of colonial possessions and things, and the setting up of sugar plantations and in these colonies with large-scale export of capital and based on sort of slave production. But these are things that
about like Cyprus, Canary Islands.
Yeah, I think what's the Tripoli, I think, as well, and it depends which city-state on that level. There was Venice and Genoa and the different ones. So that's something identified as by Lenin as something that's very distinctively new about the period starting in about 1860. But in fact, it's very identifiable as a tendency back to the late 15th and early 16th century.
James, I have a question with respect to the recent book publication that the CPGB has made of Kautsky's writings from the 1890s on colonialism and socialism, that perhaps is a different question than the question of imperialism. I think that there's a colloquial usage of the term imperialism, namely the aggrandizement of states. So if you say that imperialism has been a characteristic of capitalism from its inception, the slippage of this term imperialism in terms of the colloquial usage would suggest that, of course, imperialism is something that's been there since the beginning of civilization itself. Namely, empires colonized, and they exported forms of production with respect to colonization, and that leaves aside a use of the term that's distinct from the question of colonialism. In other words, the question of colonial policy is distinct from the question of imperialism, as Marx used the term, to talk about how the autocratic state having been overthrown, then in a sense resurfaces in the 19th century. In other words, that it's an empire in the sense of Napoleon III's Second French Empire, or Bismarck's Prussian Empire, or Queen Victoria and Benjamin Disraeli's British Empire, and that that sort of precise use of the term would suggest something quite different from the Italian city-states of the Renaissance.
Well, our quest to be sort of theoretically precise about things is always frustrated by language's very annoying habit of constantly changing, and in that sense, that there is a variation even within what you said. I mean, in the context of Britain, certainly from the 1870s, imperialism was a policy of which you approved or disapproved, and it meant precisely the empire and the colonial acquisitions and positions in that respect. In the continental European socialist literature, you have this term Kolonialpolitik, colonial policy, which is the Kautsky we've just published is entitled Socialism and Colonial Policy, the first two articles in it. But in that sense, still, then the kind of the sense of the autocratic state is a very and the empire is very, very much a French, specifically kind of a French use, which I think is copied to an extent by the Germans later on. But in that sense, we're still kind of left with the issue of, is this then a kind of a sort of novel, stage of kind of periodization? It is certainly a dynamic that is very visible in that period, but there are still, in that sense, problems with the kind of Lenin's narrative of the highest stage, where Mike argues, and I think I agree with him, that there is world historic changes going on, but what's happening is that British imperialism, in terms of British world dominance as a state, is collapsing. Is in steep decline, and it's over. And the period sort of from certainly the interwar period and the two wars, or effectively underlying the military defeat of Germany by Russia and the Allies, is a kind of hidden military defeat of Britain by the United States. Because so I think that's sort of how I characterise that, and that the kind of the emergence of extremely authoritarian states is a kind of response to the kind of chaos that engenders. You see, I think in a sense there is a contemporary resonance here, because if you look at the consequences of American interventions in Afghanistan and Iraq, and it's too early to tell with something like Libya. Is that you don't end up with kind of stable state regimes, but precisely kind of fragmentation and the emergence of exceptionally authoritarian forms of politics.
I mean, one of the things that it raises for me is the potential of assimilating late 19th century, 20th century imperialism to neo-mercantilism, or simply a continuity with mercantilism. And out of the impulse to deny that Britain was a Manchesterist liberal empire
of trade,
an empire of free trade, a kind of effacement of the question of bourgeois society itself. And of course, that can be thought of in terms of even Europe and the world. And I think I brought this up a little bit over the weekend with you. The way in which, thinking about neo-mercantilist empire has difficulties dealing with, for instance, the complex dynamics involved in the settlement of the 13 colonies classically, where really it's a product of the necessity or the kind of bleeding of population out of Britain, the dynamic of those colonies vis-a-vis the French fur empire, fur trading empire in Canada is very palpable in terms of its, it's an expansive population. It springs up on the basis of bourgeois social relations, more or less from the beginning.
This is Kautsky's point, isn't it? That Kautsky distinguishes between two kinds of colonies, and I don't know that he does it in the text that you guys republished, but rather in a later text from 1907, where he distinguishes between colonies of production and colonies of exploitation. And he characterizes the northern North American colonies in particular as essentially, workers' colonies. In other words, it's where the working class of Europe is going in order to be a working class, as opposed to a sort of, colonial agents of the state going to establish exploitation regimes.
And certainly this is the way that bourgeois liberal thinkers conceived of it, whether it was pro-British or it was pro-independence, whether it was sort of Benjamin Franklin in his British imperial sort of celebratory mode, or Benjamin Franklin in his independence mode, or Adam Smith. For all of them, this is a they talk about it in terms of the, in a sense, imperial neglect, that it's not a function of state policy exactly at all.
Yeah.
And I wonder how you think about something like that in terms of Genoa and Venice and Portuguese mercantilism.
Yeah, it's an interest. I guess there's a lot there. I mean, I think one of the striking things about, in that sense, the foundation of the 13 colonies originally is that it precisely isn't a product of a bourgeois state regime, but it is a product of pretty much the last dying gasps of kind of late feudal absolutism. This is the period, I believe, just kind of before and during the Civil War, and that is apart from the brief Restoration period, that's the death of the absolute monarchy in England. So there is still tiny. Of course, history rarely slides so very neatly into the categories we use to understand it, and that's certainly true. But I think the distinction between the work and the exploitation colonies is in this text, but it's sort of in a little footnote somewhere. It's not really elaborated on, which is kind of a shame, because I would argue that a lot of Kautsky's analysis that we've republished is kind of flawed and false. And in that sense, the reason we've republished it is because it was more influential in that sense than people give it credit for. It is footnoted in Imperialism, High Stage of Capitalism, actually, towards the end. But that is a very it's undeniable that work colonies and exploitation colonies give rise to very, very different political dynamics.
Yeah, I was very struck. I don't know if I read it or if it was in something a video that I watched, where
video of Kautsky?
Of McNair. of McNair. Every channel on the TV is a video for Kautsky. The idea that the New Model Army represented imperialism in Scotland.
And Ireland.
And more Ireland, but Scotland is tied into that dynamic to a point, yes.
Where, it seemed to me that the rise of a unified Britain, as in a sense merely an English imperial project, struck me as very strange. Especially since the Presbyterians in Scotland were at the very heart of the Civil War.
That's with Scotland, you have a more kind of complicated dynamic in the sense that there were large parts of Scotland that were, the Highland Scots, so to speak, which were, in that sense, quite a different sort of society to the Lowland Scots. And we call it the British Empire for a reason. I mean, we have this endless nightmare with kind of left nationalism in Scotland nowadays, where they're sort of arguing that Scotland has always been a terribly oppressed country, and you just have to look through the heroes of the British Empire, and they're all Scottish, Mm-hmm. They kind of bred the kind of classic administrative class into a proportionately greater extent than the English. Mm-hmm. But in that sense, it's just with Ireland, it's kind of it's much clearer because this is simply a different national entity in as much as it's cohered as a national entity at all, and it's in a sense a regularization of like an earlier kind of colonial a project starting on in the reign of Henry VIII, which is more straightforwardly kind of feudal, where the ascendancy comes from. It is also the matter of intervention in the Spanish-Dutch War, the War of the Spanish Succession, and so forth, which will also follow very closely on from the 1688, the so-called Glorious Revolution, because all the people who died outside of London, so of course it's glorious.
So one thing that occurs to me also, James, to bring it more up to the period of Kautsky's own writings, and this distinction that I was making between his writings from the late 1890s and the writings from the pre-World War I period. The 1907 text, of course, takes cognizance of the Russo-Japanese War and the Russian Revolution, indeed, and also one thing that sort of occurs to me is, of course, in this period, the Boer War. And in other words, the competing claims to freedom by the Boers and the English with respect to the nature of South Africa as a colony, and that in a sense it's inseparable from other greater world historical developments of this period of capitalism, that you would have what Kautsky would characterize as a work colony settled by the Boers in the period of the emergence of bourgeois society, precisely in the 17th century, transforming, where they can no longer make the claim that they're being, in a sense, recolonized by an exploitation regime from the British in this period of what Lenin would call imperialism, but rather, the British can pose themselves as liberal with respect to the Boers in terms of the exploitation of Africans, etc., and that this, in a sense, points to the heart of the fact that there is no such thing as work colonies anymore in this historical period of the late 19th and into the 20th century. But even when they would appear to be sort of patterned socioeconomically and politically economically on a work colony model, like with the Boers, they inevitably become an exploitation colony. And that might point to the dynamics of capitalism that are more specific to that period.
I suppose you could also say that this is a kind of, I guess, a dynamic of the United States in the 19th century, with kind of successive waves of immigration kind of going through sort of periods of sort of, in that sense, super exploitation, to use a rather dodgy Maoist word, but that kind of there's quite, in that sense, quite an interesting Maoist book by called I think it's The Myth of the White Proletariat, but he's sort of one of the fundamental argument is rubbish, but he goes through the sort of various people who have been sort of excluded from being white sort of in this period, and kind of so there's definitely because there is on the whole an ongoing dynamic towards simply the emergence of more kind of classical capitalist state regimes, which of course inevitably entail a bifurcation into classes, and that it always, because there's never been a time in that sense with just simple stable internal endogenous, but there's always been movements of populations that always ties into it in kind of interesting ways. I think that the kind of the periodization in terms of Lenin's imperialism, I'm not sure it's really on that point. I think that the fundamental argument he's making in terms of it being a new period is the kind of growth of monopoly capital and finance capital, and there's I think there were kind of arguments about kind of how far that analysis works in itself, but nonetheless you have to argue that there is a kind of ongoing process of kind of concentration of capital, and that this can be viewed by someone like Hillel Ticktin as evidence of the decline of capitalism as a mode of production, that its laws increasingly cease to operate as in their strict senses, that the law of value is increasingly supplanted by planning in terms of large trusts, and then with the imbrication with the state.
This reminds me really.
But I would say, just to make the point, that I would say that this can be analytically distinguished from the problem which we may colloquially call imperialist, of the sort of structurally necessary inequality between different states. That maybe that isn't part of that dynamic, well, obviously we have to modes of production, come into being. They mature, they decay, and they die, and either their death results in chaos or it results in a higher form of society. And we have to obviously apply that kind of periodization to capitalism as much as anything that predated it.
Mm-hmm. And this really raises the issue of the way in which the rise of socialism and socialist parties come into crisis. I mean, in some ways, the backstory of Lenin's imperialism, as you've already been laying out, goes back into Kautsky's writings in the 19th century, and even prior to that, and of course, in a way that prompts more reflection, to Bernstein. The way in which, in some ways, his grappling with the question of imperialism really, thinking about it as, if you will, a colonial issue, makes him abdicate the struggle against, if you will, Bonapartism in Germany. Right? That the question of the proletarian struggle, complicity with and struggle against Bonapartism, rather than his kind of capitulation through. So how do you think about the trajectory of Bernstein? Is Kautsky just repeating Bernstein on this issue? Is he a degradation of it? Is he repeating the kind of shortcomings of Bernstein? And what are those? And how do they relate to, of course, the more famous role of Bernstein in the revisionist dispute?
Well, it's kind of it's sort of interesting because they're very, very deeply interconnected. Actually, the Kautsky's text is in some senses a response to a debate that's been ongoing between Bernstein and Ernest Belfort Bax,
right,
who is normally characterized as a kind of semi-Marxist, but and it's precisely on this question of
who's an English.
In English, he was an outlier of the Social Democratic Federation, which ironically later went on to take a pretty repulsive social chauvinist line. But Bax's argument was essentially, in that sense, third worldist, that if you confine capitalism in a smaller space as possible, then its collapse will be hastened. Whereas Bernstein, at this point still formally an orthodox Marxist, argues that no kind of colonialism brings classic civilizing mission stuff, but with a kind of socialistic tint to it, in the sense that you need capitalism before you can have socialism, so the colonial policy brings capitalism. And Kautsky's contribution is in that sense to kind of weirdly split the difference with this kind of idea of Manchesterism versus what he describes as, in some senses, pre-capitalist forms of colonialism. There are pre-capitalist forms of colonialism that are very different from capitalist forms of colonialism. So that's the way he's framing it. And the thing is with Bernstein is that once he's accepted that it can be necessary simply to sort of make an alliance with the bourgeoisie, and in this situation or the other, the one basic tenet of kind of orthodox Marxism of the period, that you do not go into coalition with the bourgeoisie, no longer makes sense to him. And that from that germ of the colonial dispute, he ends up kind of with the preconditions of socialism, the kind of the revisionist positions. In terms of Kautsky's capitulation in 1914, it's on a theoretical level. It's simply that it frustrates his expectations. He initially supports the Reichstag faction voting for war credits in a bid to maintain unity, but becomes an anti-war figure of a basically pacifistic type, because his view is that it doesn't make sense from the perspective of capitalist progress for Germany to pursue an imperialist policy. That is actually the expression of pre-capitalist classes. So and it's completely paralyzing, because it's an absolutely incorrect assessment of the actual dynamics of the situation. And again, eventually it leads him via a more circuitous route into, well, not very great prominence in the post-war SPD. There was more of a kind of embarrassment, but nonetheless, just back into the arms of Ebert and Scheidemann.
What about Lenin writing on imperialism in 1916? I mean, of course, he's got local targets and local concerns, if you will, in terms of the national question in Poland, the Easter Uprising, but he's also attempting to analyze the war in a way that leads to very different conclusions than Kautsky as an imperialist war. And how do you understand, first of all, we haven't actually gotten to the point of how you understand Lenin's imperialism pamphlet and its intentions and perhaps its shortcomings. Maybe we'll get to its legacy later. But one thing it seems to me that from what I've read that your party has published, there's a kind of objection to Lenin's treatment of capitalism organized at a national level. His kind of conception of it is organized nationally, but it seems to me that he's trying to understand the actuality of the imperialist war, and particularly the war as working class against working class. That socialism is organized nationally, and to the extent that socialism has been harnessed to imperialism, to that the working class, via obviously the war credits, etc., in Germany most notoriously, but elsewhere, that at that level, imperialism is both a realm of conflict in Europe, of working class against working class, and that Lenin's trying to get at that.
Yeah, well, I mean, I suppose it's sort of
Lucy, did you have something you wanted to say?
I was just wanting to just interject with by imperialist war. I think, Spencer, would you suggest an inter-imperialist war?
Certainly.
Yeah.
I mean, there's two ways to attack this, which in that sense are both running themes in the pamphlet, where you have. On the one hand, the problem of kind of, it's as opposed to Kautsky's account, where the development of capitalism sort of renders these sorts of enormous confrontations for redivision of the world superfluous and just straightforwardly reactionary. For Lenin, this is a feature of this new stage of development. So his argument in terms of its what predictions you'd make on the basis of it, that there will be an underlying dynamic towards kind of military conflict that will recede and then reappear. In that sense, he's correct. So that then at the end of the day, who fights in wars? It's infamously not the people who declare them, it is the working class or the popular masses. But I suppose the other side to which I suppose is more what you're getting at is when we get to the section in that sense on the labour aristocracy and sort of explaining the emergence of social chauvinism and the complicity of sections of the working class in these adventures. For Lenin, I should say that this is something that there are various explanations for in a rather wide and complicated debate in the period. Lenin's answer is that the kind of proceeds from sort of super exploitation in the colonies can be thrown as I believe the word is crumbs from the imperialist table to a privileged layer of the working class, which we call the labour aristocracy. This is a phrase used by Engels to describe the upper echelons of the British trade union movement beforehand, and it becomes much more important in Lenin. I think the positive thing about this, and we shouldn't be like the reason in that sense we will end up talking about Lenin and I'm criticizing Lenin is because his account is simply more influential. But in this particular instance, his the subsequent history is problematic because firstly, you have the emergence of mass reformist and kind of, in that sense, sort of patriotic workers' parties outside the imperialist centres, where you would not obviously expect there to be imperialist super profits to bribe and labour aristocracy. And secondly, the problem which a lot of people point out, I think Lukács points out in passing actually in History and Class Consciousness, and he's not the only one, is that there isn't really a very easy relationship, very, very kind of directly proportional relationship between the relatively well-off strata of the working class and reformism, or vice versa, the more kind of unskilled and exploited sections of the working class, and revolutionism, as it were. That, in fact, particularly is notable in Britain, that the triple alliance of the kind of largest trade unions were very established, have been traditionally organised on craft unions and had a craft unionist basis, and had very, very kind of had comparatively much higher levels of pay and stuff, like the miners and the railway workers ended up being the core of the British general strike and the most militant unions, and that was, in the sense, it comes and goes, but the miners obviously were kind of the most bare teeth fighting contingent until Thatcher smashed them.
I mean, this is really one of the trickiest parts of the pamphlet. Is I think that one never knows exactly what Lenin is talking about in that preface, where he says, I have to pass the censorship, and I had to phrase things in a particular way. But obviously the pamphlet comes off as a kind of account in some ways of imperialist and monopoly rents being circulated back into a layer of the working class as in supplement to their wages, and that's done differentially to create this labor aristocracy. I mean, how do you understand the kind of political thrust? I mean, we know that there's a notorious history to the way that this is taken in the 20th century. This text is never forgotten, however variously it's interpreted. But how do you understand, the account of that seems in some ways economistic or sociologistic, like what the thrust is there?
Yeah, I mean, I would say it's responding to a real political problem, but here, instead of it being the local problems, if you will, that you referred to earlier, the local targets of his polemic have to be mentioned. He's polemicizing in part against Bukharin, who rejects any sort of slogans he's very maximalist at this point, and on the ultra left of the Bolsheviks, broadly speaking, and but actually his analysis of this particular.
You mean Bukharin is on the ultra?
Nikolai Bukharin's analysis of this particular question in his previous book, which is normally remembered in footnotes that really want to talk about Lenin, is that profits from imperialist endeavours and sort of super exploitation of the colonies allows the capitalist class as a whole through the state to make concessions to the working class, which may be more general or more restricted, but provides some material basis for an uneven and probably quite contingent in terms of its actual arising, but for working class support for the intervention for the capitalist state and for kind of social patriotism. I think that's a more kind of flexible analysis, and I think it sort of corresponds better to if you look at someone like Brazil, where you have is kind of rising up the pecking order, but it's for all the kind of hype about the BRICS, it's not at the top of the pile, but you have had the rise of kind of mass reformist organisations and support for that. In that way. So I think there's the Bukharin in that sense comes out of it better, but of course Bukharin is utterly politically wrong. The idea that you could just simply be utterly abstentionist and just say socialism now in the context of where there are entire populations which are utterly oppressed and dominated by kind of foreign powers is ludicrous, and Lenin points out that it is ludicrous. This is one of the weaknesses of Rosa Luxemburg's politics in an earlier period as well. Of course, that doesn't justify the various errors of and the kind of erroneous view of how you would go about overcoming that came out of the early Comintern, and most famously after Stalin and the Popular Front turn. But nonetheless, that is, Lenin identifies a serious political problem there that Bukharin doesn't, and that is an advantage of his account, although it obviously has a sort of double-edged quality given the inheritance.
I mean, here it seems to me that Lenin's focus on monopoly and the way in the political mediation of productivity, in that way, the relationship of monopoly to the state, and the way in which monopoly capital is bound up with tariff policies and so forth, and that those monopoly rents are essentially political in the way that they're distributed, is an attempt at trying to get at both a kind of characterization of imperialism as a relationship of state and society in Europe, back to this question of Bonapartism, and an issue of what is politics in the age of imperialism. I mean, are we just resting, are we resting higher wages from the profits of capital, or are we struggling against an already political mediation of social wealth in terms of how rent is circulating in society? I mean, it seems to me that there's a very kind of, obviously this is a pamphlet that we can, that's extremely puzzling in a lot of ways today, but especially when we try to think about how Lenin understood the political thrust of that. So I'm wondering, how you think about that question as a kind of extension of Lenin, of the argument that Lenin never forgets, which is the argument against first the revisionists and now increasingly the Kautskian, the SPD.
Yes.
In terms of how to conceive of the proletarian socialist struggle in the epoch of imperialism.
Well, I mean, it is in that sense a real issue. It's a kind of, and Mike, who obviously I'm kind of drawing a lot of my criticisms from his work, has made a point on many occasions that the kind of not sure so much how it works and how it unfolds in America, but in Europe you often when leftists want to go to the polls and appear respectable, they tend to demand basically what would be standard post-war welfare state Keynesianism, and there's no way to avoid the fact that the buck stops somewhere, and it is about being able to impose a harsher level of discipline on other countries. The European welfare statism coincided with the rise of the IMF and institutions like that, and the effect they had in the kind of former colonial world and so forth. So it is there are a lot of questions tied up in Lenin's pamphlet. Is tiny and quite schematic, but also very ambitious in the amount that it tries to tie together. And there is, in that sense, a rounded political account of socialist strategy, where it has to kind of deal with all these issues in some ways. But I think the kind of crystallizing a lot of ongoing tendencies, which can, or in the sense, obviously interrelated in different ways, but and that also kind of analytically separate in terms of the way they come out of the dynamics of actual kind of capitalist history. That in that sense, is the flaw. The rise of the mass working class movement does necessarily changes the way the capitalist state operates, because that is in a sense what the state is there for. And once it becomes clear that you simply can't repress it in a way of sort of wishing it away, you get constant sort of attempts to kind of intervene in the internal political life of the workers' movement, going from the sort of battle between liberals and Tories for working class votes that dominates British politics in a very, very major way in the later 19th century, to kind of situations where you have the rise of something. Again, I'm talking about Britain, but I think it's very much clear with Britain the rise of something like the Labour Party, which becomes a sort of an institutional form for that sort of alliance, if you will. You got this sort of but it's really, in that sense, it's a real political problem. But that in that sense, it happens in countries whether or not they end up with colonial holdings, and the presence of colonial holdings provide a means for export population and so forth, and ways to deal with that. But in that sense, it's still an analytically distinct tendency, and they come together in a very, very violent and apocalyptic way in this period.
Let's come back and try to tie some of these themes together. We started off by talking about the anti-war movement, and in Britain that took the form of the Stop the War Coalition. How do you understand the destiny of Lenin and the Bolshevik arguments immediately after the revolution, embodied in the early congresses of the Communist International? What are in a sense the way stations through which that politics travels and is perhaps degraded in arriving at the Stop the War Coalition? So how would you characterize the failings of the Stop the War Coalition? What's at the heart of that? Where does it immediately derive from, and where does it more distantly derive from?
The one thing that I'd like to start out by saying that it wasn't 10 years. It's not 10 years since the beginning of the anti-war movement. The anti-war movement sprung up initially against Afghanistan, although it was considerably smaller. We're 10 years since the peak, and I suppose the sort of trough can be exemplified simply with this 10 years after kind of love-in that the British Stop the War Coalition had. And they had a little session on the intervention in Mali, where Victoria Britton, a sort of liberal journalist who'd done a lot of anti-war journalism, and she turned out she supported the intervention in Mali. And there were all these sort of, Trotskyists and sort of Stalinists in the crowd, just like, what the hell is going on? And that's what happened. Well, it ended up is that there was a chance to win the debate in society, and over the course of 10 years of traditional ideological scuffles, we lost to that level of degree, and the kind of immediate, it can't be avoided that the core leadership of the Stop the War during its high point, or the Vietnam generation. And what you had with the kind of Vietnam generation is at the end of the day, the Americans were defeated, and they were defeated partly on the home front by kind of demonstrations and kind of lack of discipline in the ranks and those sorts of things. But they were also defeated by an overall dynamic in international politics, which was the politics of the Cold War. This, I believe, you can't ignore the fact that around about this time, I believe, the Russians built the first intercontinental ballistic missiles that could actually hit America directly, and various other oncoming dynamics in its sort of international politics. And what you have with Stop the War in that sense was an attempt to, by the two factions, if you will, of the anti-war movement, of the anti-Vietnam War movement. On the one hand, the tanky Stalinists who went out with pacifist slogans, peace in Vietnam, and on the other hand, the Trotskyists, such as they were, who went out chanting, ho 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 Chi Minh and all that kind of stuff. They still underlying that kind of, very much the difference in tone, I suppose, was a kind of shared view of how these things could be won.
Let me just press you a little bit on this. I mean, how do you understand it when you say that the Americans were defeated in Vietnam?
Well,
I mean, in what way were they defeated in Vietnam that they weren't defeated in Iraq?
Well, it's well,
or how do we understand the war aims in that sense?
Yeah, well, the war aims in that sense were different to a point. Ostensibly, the intervention in Vietnam was a defensive war of an ally, but what it unambiguously failed simply because the North, ended up conquering the entire country, and we have the famous images of the last American troops leaving off the roof of the embassy and all that kind of thing. So it is simply undeniable that it was an unsuccessful war effort, and it obviously wasn't a direct military defeat inflicted by the NLF on America, but that in that sense makes it a more kind of important in the imagination of that generation, both in the official communist parties and the official kind of left, and also the new left and the kind of far left, Trotskyist, Maoist, whatever. Is that it was they could with some legitimacy claim it as their victory. But misunderstood what that meant in terms of the overall context in which they were working. So I think in Iraq, it's I would say it's even still too early to tell, because we don't know what the region is in such enormous kind of tumult at the moment. I think maybe one possible outcome would be what you could very blasé call what we call a score draw in football. That on the one hand they'll lose a large part of the country to the Iranian sphere of influence, but they've got Kurdistan as a basis for American politics, for American interest in the region. So I think it's too early to tell how that is actually going to play out. And you see with them making nice with the Muslim Brotherhood and Egypt and so forth, they do have some level of contingency plans for maintaining some kind of initiative in the region.
Okay, I'm going to ask you one more question in just a second, but first of all, you're listening to WHPK 88.5 FM. This is Radical Minds, and it's now 6 minutes to 4. Adult vaccination. The National Foundation for Infectious Diseases reminds you that vaccination is not just for kids. More U.S. adults die of vaccine-preventable diseases than from breast cancer, AIDS, or traffic accidents. Talk with your doctor and visit www.adultvaccination.org. And Men's Preventative Health. Have you ever gotten the medical tests you need? For a list of tests every man should have, go to ahrg.gov. And I want to remind everyone out there who's interested in left politics that you can come to, if you're a student on this campus, you can come to the second floor of the undergraduate library, now a coffee shop at 4:30 for the Platypus coffee break. And now back to James. So James, just to tie this is the last question. So tie what we're talking about in terms of the anti-Vietnam movement and the kind of Soviet bloc inspired anti-imperialism of that period in which Trotskyists and Maoists participated differentially to the earlier period going back into the aftermath of the Russian Revolution and the problematic legacies of the Second International as they're instantiated in the national and colonial questions of the Second and Fourth Congresses.
Yeah, I mean, the decisive thing that has to be stated first is simply the rise of the Stalinist regimes, and however you characterize them, there's 28 million different varieties of theory of the Soviet Union, and they're all out there for you to look at. It nonetheless represented a serious alternative kind of power bloc, particularly after the Second World War, which kind of complicated the dynamics of, if you will, the world system. But in terms of the kind of political ancestry of this, the the necessity of kind of championing kind of the kind of democratic rights of oppressed peoples, which I accept. I mean, I can't really go into the reasoning right here, but ends up expressed in a form with a kind of expectation that kind of dynamic will inevitably thrust the simply supporting movements of national self-determination will thrust socialists, the communist organisations, to the kind of fore of those struggles, and then sort of wider influence within the resigning regimes. And this is it's already very problematic by the time we get to the death of Lenin and the kind of general Trotsky stating of when foreign interventions of Comintern sort of got worse. This was in the 1921. Famously, Kemal Atatürk gets the leadership of the Communist Party of Turkey out in a boat into the middle of the Dead Sea and advises them to learn to swim. Already you have things like what happened later in China.
Which the Trotskyists would be more focused on, because, in that sense I would argue that their policy isn't sufficiently differentiated. I mean, whatever you think of Mao and Maoism, there was his immediate tactical judgment: we need to run to the hills, and from now on we need to be fighting the nationalists as well as the Japanese, was the correct judgment, rather than Trotsky sort of fight the Japanese but kind of maintain independence. I mean, the Kuomintang don't care how independent you are, they'll still shoot you to death. So there's and that kind of, from then on, though, Maoism is nonetheless a straightforwardly, third worldist political orientation. So Maoism as an international political trend does not embody the shoot the nationalists as well tactical judgment. It embodies an intensified version of the kind of strategic alliance with the national bourgeoisie against the kind of compradors in the colonial countries, and the emergence of sort of independent socialistic, as it were, nationalist regimes. Stalinism, official Stalinism, like the encirclement of the city,
surrounding the city. Yeah. Yeah, I mean, they still had things to say on domestic policy in this period. They don't really now. It's sort of getting a little bit problematic, really. The third worldism is kind of getting more prominence. But in terms of the official Stalinist policy, the policy of supporters of the Soviet Union, pro-Soviet communist parties and so forth, you see an emergence of kind of just simply increasingly rightward drifting kind of reformist politics based on strategic alliances with social democracy and a purported progressive bloc of the bourgeoisie, even in the imperialist countries. The state monopoly capitalism, which would put in dissident France the 200 families of like the most monopolistic, brutal forms of the bourgeoisie against everyone else. And for Trotskyists, you have this view of the permanent revolution, where the idea is that you can't separate these things. You can't separate the national democratic revolution from the socialist revolution in the kind of third world countries. But in the end, it ended up simply reproducing in actual Trotskyist politics the same division, because it's like, okay, but we can work with these people for the democratic stage, and then we'll be catapulted to the front of it, because permanent revolution means that you must have the socialist revolution immediately after it. So you end up with a situation in, say, in Iran. Iran is a classic example where it doesn't matter if you were a Stalinist organization was purged, Trotskyists were purged. None of them had an adequate policy to deal with the actual dynamics of the emergence of this sort of strange reactionary religious nationalism.
James, I want to thank you for coming onto the show.
Thanks for inviting me.
Lucy.
Thank you.